They sent us a distress signal. We answered it. That was our first mistake, assuming that when humanity said we're coming, they meant soldiers. They did not mean soldiers. They meant all of it. The broken ones, the grieving ones, the ones who hadn't slept in 3 days and were running on something they called gas station coffee and pure, unreasonable stubbornness. They meant the ones who laughed at the wrong moment, not because they were unafraid, but because fear had apparently filled up and overflowed into something else entirely. Something we do not have a word for in Verith. I have filed 14 incident reports in the last 6 rotations. My superior, Commander Yeth, has stopped reading them. She just marks them received and stares at a fixed point on the wall for 30 seconds. I have started timing this. It is always 30 seconds. I think she is praying to something. I am Observation Liaison Drivak, 4th seat of the Verith Intelligence Corps, and I have spent 8 years studying conflict doctrine across 23 spacefaring species. I was not prepared. No one was prepared. This is my account of what humanity deployed when the galaxy needed saving. I am still not entirely sure whether to be grateful or to file a restraining order against their entire species. The first thing I noticed about Sergeant Yara Voss was that she was eating. Not eating the way Verith eat, small, measured, standing still with proper post-consumption silence. She was eating while moving, while checking her weapon, while talking to 3 people at once, and I checked my sensor twice, simultaneously reading something off a surface tablet balanced on her forearm. The food was some kind of compressed block wrapped in foil. She had bitten it in half and pocketed the rest. As if the other half could wait. I noted this at 14.07. I would note a great many things after that. We were in the staging corridor of Forward Installation Marin, a mid-tier coordination hub that had been, until approximately 70 hours ago, a quiet, borderline irrelevant outpost on the corridor's eastern reach. Then, the Shulkethi had punched through the Marin threshold, swallowed the 2 colonies behind it like something that doesn't need to chew, and, suddenly, everyone was very interested in Forward Installation Marin. The Verith High Command solution was to hold the threshold with a combined species coalition, Verith Armor, Veresi Scouts, and 1 human rapid response unit. The thinking, as I understood it, was that human units had demonstrated a particular operational tolerance for high-casualty environments. They had also, more relevantly, responded to the call-up in under 4 hours, which no other species present had managed. What High Command had not specified, what I do not think High Command had considered, was which humans would show up. Sergeant Voss was the ranking field operative of what the humans called Fireteam Actual, though the name meant nothing to me until I asked, and, even then, the explanation, "it just sounds right," satisfied no definitional requirement I could apply to it. She was not tall by human standards, I was told. Medium height, dark complexion, hair pulled back with a piece of wire she'd apparently stripped from a communications panel. I noted the wire. I noted it because my field contact, a young Verith second ranker named OSS who had more enthusiasm than sense, kept trying to offer her a proper hair fastener from his kit, and she kept waving him off with the same hand she was using to pull up topographical overlays. "She's busy," I told him. "She doesn't have to use the emergency wire," he said, distressed. I added that exchange to the log at 14.09. I don't know why. Something told me the texture of these small things would matter later. The briefing happened at 14.22. I say briefing. What I mean is, Voss spread a terrain scan on the table and started talking, and the rest of us either kept up or we didn't. The Shulkethi advance had 3 columns, each probing for the weakest corridor node. Standard expansion doctrine, not sophisticated, but effective. They didn't need to be clever when their lead units were 5 meters tall and absorbed small arms fire like we absorb rain. "We can't stop all 3 columns," said Commander Yeth. "Correct," said Voss. A silence. OSS twitched. Commander Yeth waited for elaboration that didn't come. "So you're proposing a targeted containment of 1 column," said one of the Veresi Scouts, Liaison Fan, who spoke in clipped, efficient units of language that I had always admired before today, when it felt like the only island of reason in the room. "No." Voss pointed to the center column. "I'm proposing we let them think they've broken the center." Commander Yetha's secondary eyelids, the ones she only uses when genuinely startled, closed once. You're proposing we feign collapse. I'm proposing we build them a door and let them walk through it. Voss tapped the corridor junction on the scan. Shulkethi advanced doctrine prioritizes momentum. They see a gap, they flood it. We know that. We use that. Into what? Said Yeth. Into the Marin processing floor. I looked at the scan. The Marin processing floor was a sealed industrial chamber, approximately 400 meters across, 6 levels deep, with a single primary access point on the north face. That's a dead end, I said. I had not intended to speak aloud. Voss looked at me for the first time. She had dark eyes that moved like they were taking notes. That's the point, she said. Timestamp 15.44. I have, in my 8 years with the Intelligence Corps, observed 41 unique engagement scenarios across species with wildly divergent tactical frameworks. The Theresi fight with geometrical precision. The Grenathi fight in emotional unison, their battle state functioning almost as a shared cognition. The Verith, my own people, fight in ordered hierarchical waves, each layer aware of the layer above and below. What Voss's team did was not any of these things. Her 4-person unit, herself, a large human called Cho who barely spoke, a younger one called Nika who laughed at completely inappropriate intervals, and a 4th called Marcus who was apparently the explosive specialist and smelled persistently of something astringent, moved through Marin installation like they had been born in the walls. Each of them making decisions that were not coordinated. Not called out. Not signaled. Cho moved left, Nika moved to cover Cho's left without being asked. Marcus went ahead of his position by 10 meters, and Voss did not correct him because she had already calculated that he needed to be there. They functioned the way a hand functions, not because the fingers consult each other, but because they share something I cannot name. I was following at the rear with OSS, whose job was technically documentation support and who I had already caught crying twice, once at a Shulkethi casualty count update, once, I think, at something Nika said that I did not fully catch. Does your team always move like this? I asked Voss during a pause at the corridor junction, because I needed to understand what I was watching. She looked at me. Bit off the second half of the food block she'd pocketed at 14.07. I noted, 15.44. She had held the other half of that meal for an hour and a half. Move like what? She said. Timestamp 16.30. The feint worked. That is an extraordinary sentence to write. Feints work in simulations. They work in historical analysis. They work in doctrine texts that Verith academics spend careers writing. They do not routinely work against Shulkethi column advances because the Shulkethi do not stop when something looks too easy. They are not built for suspicion. They are built for forward, 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 eat what's ahead. Voss had known this. She had known it the way I know the weight of my own field kit, not from reading about it, but from somewhere that predates the reading. She collapsed the center corridor exactly as planned. Cho and Marcus drew fire to pull the column's attention, pulling back in a retreat that looked, I reviewed the feeds afterward, genuinely panicked. Nika was the anchor. I asked Voss why she'd chosen Nika for the anchor position, given that Nika was the least experienced operative present. Because Nika doesn't look dangerous, said Voss. I had no response to that. The Shulkethi column, a 40-unit advance team with 3 heavy assault platforms, flooded the apparent gap in 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Into the corridor. Into the junction. Through the north face of the Marin processing floor. Marcus sealed the entrance from the inside, which, I want to be precise here, was a position he should not have been able to reach in time. I don't know when he moved. I had been watching the feeds. I did not see him cross the junction. He was simply, at one point, not there, and then, he was there, where he needed to be, with the detonator already out. He winked at the Theresi scout standing next to me, which I am told is a human expression of this was always going to be fine, though in context it felt more like I just frightened myself badly and I'm covering for it. I appreciated that he was covering for it. It made me feel less alone. Timestamp 17.08. The column was not destroyed. I want to be clear on this point because I think the casualty assessment sent to High Command was overly optimistic. Several Shulkethi units breached the processing floor's east wall under pressure and pulled back through a collapsed maintenance channel we had not fully mapped. Voss knew this was possible. She had not shared this with Commander Yeth because, and she said this with the same tone she used for everything, flat and direct and somehow both reassuring and deeply uncomfortable, she would have changed the plan and the plan was better. Yeth was silent for the 30-second count when Voss said this. I timed it. Then, she said, how many escaped? 11, said Voss. They'll report back that the Marin approach is held and contested. They won't call for a second push until they redouble the column. That buys us time, said Yeth. Yeah. How much time? Voss looked at the scan. Then, she looked at the corridor wall, which was doing nothing. She seemed to be calculating something that wasn't on any chart. Enough, she said. She didn't say for what. I didn't ask. OSS wrote it down anyway. Timestamp 18.55 Supplemental Note Privac D. I have filed my first incident report of this posting. I will note, for the record, that it contains very few incidents in the traditional sense. What it contains is this: Sergeant Voss held a junction with 4 personnel against a 40-unit advance, bought a strategic window for the full coalition, and ate a food block and 2 have separated by 97 minutes without comment or apparent distress. I asked Cho, her largest team member, if Voss had always been like this. He considered the question with a slow seriousness I had not expected. Cho was a man of negligible words, but the words he used arrived like furniture being moved into place. She's been worse, he said. Worse how? He didn't answer immediately. He was cleaning his weapon, which was spotless, with a small cloth that was not. She used to not eat at all, he said. During progress, I guess. He said that last part the way you say something that is a joke and also not. I added it to the log and sat for a while with the threshold holding and the processing floor cooling and the smell of Marcus's astringent something drifting from somewhere down the hall. OSS had fallen asleep upright against the corridor wall. I let him sleep. The galaxy, at that moment, was in peril. And Sergeant Yara Voss was somewhere in the installation, finishing her food. By the second morning I had stopped sleeping in shifts and started sleeping in small collapses, the way OSS did 5 or 10 minutes at a time, propped against something structural, waking without knowing why and then knowing exactly why. The Shulkethi had not pushed the second column yet. We knew it was coming. That knowledge was doing something to the installation that I can only describe as weathering. The waystone doesn't look different after rain, except that it is. The coalition's full strength at Marin, at this point, numbered 63. I ran that number often. It had a particular quality of wrongness that I kept testing, the way you press a bruise to confirm it's still there. 63 against what was, by scout estimate, a vanguard force of 400, with another 800 to 1200 units 3 days behind it. The Verith detachment was 41 personnel. The Theresi scouts numbered 12. Fireteam actual was 4. High Command had promised reinforcements. High Command's reinforcements were 2 days out. This information lived in the installation the way cold lives in a room, present in everything, named by no one. Timestamp 7.40. I found Marcus in the eastern maintenance corridor at 7.40, doing something to a ventilation panel that I could not categorize. He had 3 tools out that I did not recognize, a 4th that appeared to be a general-purpose blade that had been modified at the handle end in a way that violated several design principles I could name. He was also, somehow, both focused and deeply unbothered, which I had come to understand was a human performance state that bore no relationship to their actual internal condition. What are you building? I asked. Whom? He held up a cylindrical component. Nothing yet. Thinking. About what? He considered. If they breach the East Corridor approach, the junction choke point has a 3-second exposure window before it angles around to cover. 3 seconds is too long. What reduces it? That's what I'm thinking about. He went back to looking at the ventilation panel. I stood there for a moment, trying to determine whether this was useful activity or a displacement behavior, and concluded that for Marcus specifically, these were the same thing. Do you do this between every engagement? I asked. Do what? Walk around looking at walls. He tilted his head. It was not a dismissal. It was a genuine reconsideration. Yeah, he said. But I call it something else. What do you call it? Making sure. I wrote that down. I wasn't sure what I was recording anymore, exactly. My incident reports had been submitted. My tactical observations were logged. What I was compiling now was something else, something that felt necessary in a way I could not defend to a superior officer. OSS, who had followed me, touched my elbow. I brought coffee, he whispered, as if Marcus might overhear and confiscate it. He had, somehow, located a human-compatible caffeine preparation unit somewhere in the installation's galley section. I do not know how. I had stopped asking OSS how he found things, because the answer was always some variation of I asked nicely. He held a second cup out to Marcus. Marcus took it without looking up. Thanks, little guy. OSS looked at me with an expression of profound satisfaction. He was 6 centimeters taller than Marcus. I noted this at 7.43 and kept it because it was the first thing that had made me want to laugh since the threshold opened. Timestamp 11.19. The second Shulkethi push came at 11.19. Not the column we expected. Not the column we'd planned for. The East Corridor. I have reviewed the sensor data 7 times and I still do not fully understand how they mapped the approach. The Shulkethi are not sophisticated in the way the Verith defines sophisticated. They do not run multi-vector intelligence analysis. They do not maintain dedicated scout units in the way we do. But they learn. Slowly, in the aggregate, like a tide finding the crack in a seawall. The 11 survivors from the processing floor had reported back. They had reported the north face was sealed and contested. They had reported nothing about the east. Voss was at the junction before the alarm finished cycling. I don't know where she had been. She was simply there, the way Marcus had been simply there the previous day. And I was beginning to suspect this was a specific human combat skill that no doctrine document I had ever read had adequately named. East Corridor, second approach, she said, not to anyone in particular, or to everyone, which seemed to mean the same thing with her team. Nika, already moving, I got the left branch. Cho, right. Marcus, from somewhere behind me, give me 4 minutes. 4 minutes for what? No one asked, because no one needed to ask. Voss had already turned to Commander Yeth, who had arrived in the corridor with 6 Verith personnel and the particular expression of someone doing very fast math with numbers they don't like. Can you hold the primary junction for 4 minutes? Voss asked. Against what force? Don't know yet. Another 30-second prayer. Yeth did it standing up this time, which I interpreted as progress. Yes, she said. Timestamp 11.23. The East Corridor force was 22 units. Smaller than the first column push. Faster. The Shulkethi's eastern vanguard moved differently from the column we'd faced the day before, it tighter, more directional. Less flooding, more cutting. I realized, watching the feed with my throat doing something involuntary, that they had adapted the doctrine from the North Face failure. In less than 20 hours. I flagged this in my log at 11.23 and, then, stopped writing for a moment to stare at the feed the way Commander Yeth stared at the wall, and I understood, for the first time with any real conviction, why she did it. The Verith detachment held the primary junction. 41 personnel, prepared positions, standard defensive doctrine. They held it. They held it for 3 minutes and 58 seconds before the line began fracturing, not breaking, fracturing, the distinction being the difference between a collapse and a controlled yielding, and then Marcus's work activated. I still do not fully understand what he built in that ventilation panel. The technical report I wrote afterward describes it as a pressure differential deployment mechanism, which is accurate in the way a description of fire as rapid oxidation is accurate, meaning it captures nothing essential. What it did was reroute the Eastern Corridor's primary atmospheric system into the junction in a specific way, for approximately 8 seconds. That made the Shulkethi Advanced Unit's sensory apparatus, which relies heavily on pressure gradients to navigate at speed, effectively blind. 8 seconds. The Verith line reset. The junction held. Cho came back through the corridor with a gash across one forearm that was not small, and sat down against the wall, and said nothing, and began field wrapping the arm with the focused disinterest of someone who has done this often enough that it no longer qualifies as an event. Nika appeared from the left branch at a run, slowed to a walk, slowed to standing still, and then, in a behavioral transition I had genuinely never observed in any other species, started laughing. Not hysterical. Not shocked. Just laughing, the way water finds level, inevitably, without decision. "That's disgusting," she said, apparently to the corridor. "That's so disgusting, I don't," said Voss, though she was almost smiling. Almost. The smell won it, I know. Like something died, Nika. Twice. Cho looked up from his arm. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. I filed this at 11.31. I don't know what category to put it under. Morale assessment, maybe. Timestamp, 14.50, the second push retreated to the mapped access corridors at 13.07. Standard withdrawal, they were not routed, just unwilling to commit further into contested ground without better intelligence. That gave us something like a window. I used the window to do the one thing I had been avoiding, which was the accounting. We had held for 18 hours. We had taken 11 casualties among the Verith detachment, 3 critical, 2 of whom were not expected to complete the rotation. The Theresi scouts had lost 1. Fireteam Actual had lost no one, which I recorded and, then, sat with in a way I couldn't account for. The reinforcements were now approximately 36 hours out. That gap had a shape to it. I found Voss in the galley at 14.50. She was sitting with her back to the wall. I noticed she always sat with her back to walls, not anxiously but practically, the way you pack a bag so the heaviest part rides against your spine, drinking something from a sealed container that smelled aggressively chemical. "What is that?" I asked. She looked at the container. "The label says green tea." "Does it taste like green tea?" "The label says green tea," she said again, with a particular inflection I had learned meant moving on. I sat across from her. OSS, behind me, found his own seat and began composing what I assumed was either a report or a personal letter. With OSS, these had become indistinguishable. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked Voss. She looked at me carefully. "Field operations," I clarified. "Coalition engagements." 7 years. "You look," I stopped myself. I had been about to say younger than that sounds, which I recognized was an incomplete and potentially inaccurate assessment. She waited, watching me not finish the sentence. "You look," I started again, "like someone who has done this for 7 years. A pause. She looked at the container. "Good answer," she said. Timestamp, 16.33, supplemental note, I have been trying to identify what it is, specifically, about Sergeant Voss that constitutes the primary observation of this posting. Not the tactical competency that is documented, that is filed, that will appear in the official account as numbers and timelines and efficiency metrics. Something else. At 16.33, I watched her sit with Cho while the medic completed his wound dressing. She didn't talk. She didn't review anything. She just sat there in the specific quality of silence that isn't absence but presence, the kind that says I'm here and I'm not going anywhere, not as reassurance but as fact. Cho didn't look at her. He didn't need to. I have seen Verith commanders perform this behavior. It is, in our culture, a deliberate and formal act, a recognized duty of the commanding rank, with specific protocols around duration and expression. We have a word for it that translates roughly as witnessed witnessing. Voss was doing the same thing without any of the protocol. Without, as far as I could tell, it costing her anything. No. That's not right. It was costing her something. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the slight flatness around her eyes. It was costing her something, and she was paying it without commentary, without credit, without, as far as I could determine, expectation of either. I closed my log at 16.41 and did not open it again until the next push began. The galaxy was still in peril. 36 hours. The shape of the gap did not change. But something in the room around it did. The third push came at 3.17. Not a column. Not a vanguard unit. Not a probe. All 3 corridors. Simultaneously. I had been asleep for 40 minutes when OSS shook my shoulder, and the look on his face was the kind that skips past words entirely. I was upright and moving before I was fully conscious, which I mention only because I had not, until that moment, believed myself capable of it. The Schulkäthi had not been waiting for intelligence. They had been waiting for us to sleep. Timestamp 3.22. Boss was already at the command table when I arrived, and she was doing something I had not seen her do before. She was still. Not composed still, not professional still. Actually still, standing with both hands flat on the table, looking at the 3-vector incursion read on the scan, and not moving. For approximately 6 seconds. I counted. Then, she looked up. Not at Commander Yeth. Not at the scan. At me. How long for the reinforcements, she said. 18 hours, I said. Approximately. She looked back at the scan. Okay, she said. That was all. The stillness ended. She started moving and she did not stop again. Timestamp 3.31. Here is what 63 personnel, most of them not human, did with 18 hours of gap and 3 converging columns. They did not hold all 3 corridors. Boss said this plainly at 3.31 to Commander Yeth, who said I know, which surprised me that they had arrived at the same place, or maybe it shouldn't have, because Yeth was not a poor tactician, she was just not accustomed to thinking the way Voss thought, and proximity, it appeared, had accomplished something. We hold the north face, said Voss. We abandon east, we abandon the secondary junction. Full strength on north. If they take the secondary junction, said the Theresi liaison fun, they will have a clear approach to the installation core. Yes. That is the installation core. Yes, said Voss, and they'll want to move on it immediately, which means we know exactly where they'll be. Fun was quiet. OSS touched my arm very lightly, which I had come to recognize as his way of saying, "Are you seeing this?" I was seeing it. The logic was not complicated. It was actually very simple. Pull 3 columns into one choke point by giving them what they wanted, then defend the one choke point instead of 3 corridors. Remove complexity. Accept the narrow margin. Simple. The margin being that if the north face failed, the installation fell. Not complex. Just load-bearing. Timestamp 4.05, 41 Verith. 12 Theresi. 4 humans. 57 on the line, 6 personnel, 2 injured to hold position, including 2 of Yetha's best armor frame operators. The Schulkäthi secondary and eastern columns hit the abandoned corridors and, as Voss had said they would, accelerated toward the core. Gravity of pressure. They couldn't help it. The gap looked like winning. The gap led them to the north face. I was at the rear coordination post, which is a formal way of saying I was standing at the back of a room with a feed showing me things I could not intervene in, updating the log with timestamps that would either be useful to someone later or would be the last things I ever wrote. I had decided, at some point in the previous hour, that the log was going to be accurate even if that was all it was. 3.17 Third push begins. 4.05 Consolidation to north face complete. 4.09 First Schulkäthi units reach secondary junction. 4.14 Eastern end, secondary columns begin convergence toward installation core. OSS was standing next to me. He had stopped crying about 40 minutes ago, which I thought might mean he'd moved past fear into the territory past it, which in my observation has no name but occupies the place where the body runs out of the fuel that fear burns and starts using something else. He was writing, too. He had a small physical notation device he'd carried since the first day, and he was writing in it with one hand, watching the feed with the other. I asked him once what he wrote in it, and he told me it was his memory training exercises. OSS had a mild condition that made long-term retention unreliable, so he wrote things down as they happened to anchor them. I watched him write, 4.14. North Face holding. All personnel present. That was not tactically relevant information. It was the most important thing he'd written all deployment. Timestamp, 4.40, for 26 minutes the North Face held, and I tracked it in increments, and I will not pretend that I was calm about this, because I was not calm about this. The Shulkethi convergence force numbered somewhere between 90 and 110. The sensor fog from the breach made precise counting impossible. The Verith armor frame operators were performing at capacity. The Theresi scouts were in the venting system above the corridor, which was something I had not known was tactically viable until Liaison Fin dropped into the corridor from the ceiling at 4.22 and put 3 heavy pulse rounds into a Shulkethi assault platform from above and, then, disappeared back into the ceiling like they'd simply decided to unexist. I noted this. Fireteam Actual was at the center of the line. Not because Voss had been ordered there. Not because the center was the tactically indicated position for a 4-person element. Because Cho was the largest physical presence on the line, and his being visible had some effect on Shulkethi unit targeting behavior that I am going to include in my final report under the heading Anomalous Deterrence Effect, mechanism unclear. Because Nika's particular way of moving, fast and lateral and somehow slightly wrong in the way she occupied space, made her disproportionately effective at close range. Because Marcus had done something to the North Face junction in the hour before the push that I still cannot fully account for, and at 4.33 it became relevant in a way that bought the line approximately 90 seconds, which I know sounds like nothing and was everything. Because Voss was there. I have typed and deleted a more elaborate version of that sentence 4 times. It keeps coming out as analysis, tactical presence, command coherence, unit coordination under pressure. The analysis is correct, and it is also not what I am trying to say. What I am trying to say is, I watched the feed and I watched the line, and I watched the places where the line should have fractured but didn't, and they corresponded, consistently, to where she was. That is not a doctrine. That is not a metric. I don't know what it is. Timestamp, 5.18, at 5.18, the line fractured. Not catastrophically. The eastern Verith position ceded 3 meters under simultaneous pressure from 2 Shulkethi assault platforms, and 3 meters doesn't sound like much until you've watched a feed where 3 meters is the difference between a corridor and a room. I heard Commander Yeth on the command channel. Her voice had a quality I had not heard from her before, not panic, because Yeth did not panic. Something older than panic. Something that lives in the part of the body below the ribcage. Then, I heard Voss. She didn't shout. She never shouted. She said 3 words in the channel with the same inflection she used for everything, flat and direct, Cho. Left side. And Cho, who had been holding center, moved. I watched him move on the feed. He was large by human standards, and that largeness was not, in the context of Shulkethi assault platforms, strategically relevant. By every reasonable calculation, this was not going to work. He hit the gap anyway. I have read, in xenosociological texts I no longer find theoretical, about the phenomenon of cooperative species extending protective behavior beyond self-interest under extreme conditions. It is considered a cognitive artifact of social bonding chemistry. A predictable emergent behavior with calculable parameters. I watched Cho hit a Shulkethi assault platform with his shoulder at full run. The platform, which weighed somewhere between 4 and 6 times what Cho weighed, staggered. I don't have a calculable parameter for that. Timestamp, 6.04, the reinforcements arrived at 6.04. Not 18 hours. 11 hours and 42 minutes. I asked, later, how they had arrived 7 hours ahead of projection. The answer I received was that the fleet commander had pushed the drive threshold above recommended parameters when the coalition casualty reports came in. I filed this in the log without comment. The Shulkethi convergence force broke under the reinforcement arrival, not immediately, not in an instant, but the way a structure fails when the last weight is added, which is, all at once and, after everything. The north face held. Marin installation held. The threshold held. Timestamp 7.30 supplemental end, final note, Prevac D. After the all-clear was established, I found Voss outside the installation on a secondary observation platform. This was technically prohibited while structural integrity of the outer sections was still being assessed, but I had observed that Voss treated prohibited things as advisories rather than instructions, and, since I was allegedly following her for documentation purposes, I followed her here too. She was sitting on the platform edge with her legs over the side and her back straight, looking at the threshold. The threshold from here was not impressive, visually. It looked like a smear of pressure distortion in mid-vacuum. It looked like nothing. I sat next to her. At a careful distance. "We have a word," I said, after a while, in Verith. "For what you did at the line." She looked at me. "It means," I stopped. "It doesn't translate cleanly. The closest is willing the margin to exist. As if by being present in a place where the outcome is uncertain, you change the probability by the fact of your belief in it." She was quiet. "I'm not sure I believe in that," she said finally. "I know. She paused. Looked at the threshold. The line was going to hold or it wasn't. Cho made the call. Marcus built the thing. Nika moved the way Nika moves. She stopped herself. I waited. I didn't want to be anywhere else, she said. That was all. OSS appeared behind me 5 minutes later with something hot in a container, which he distributed without comment. I held mine. The threshold held its distortion against the dark. Somewhere behind us in the installation, Nika was laughing at something. Cho was not. Marcus was, in all likelihood, walking a wall somewhere, making sure. I looked at my log. The final entry was timestamped 7.30. I wrote, Marin holds. Full might deployed. See attached. The attached was everything. Every entry. Every timestamp. Every cup of something that tasted wrong, and every meal eaten in 2 halves, and every 30-second prayer, and one small man writing in a notebook with one hand while watching the world hold or not hold with the other. I closed the log. The galaxy was still in peril. Somewhere. The Shulkethi were still out there, and they were slow learners but not non-learners, and whatever came next was going to be informed by what happened here. So was I. I never did file that restraining order.